Okay, welcome to Locked In Leadership. And I'm Bill Stebbins, retired Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Army. And tonight's episode 115 is called, I've labeled it, I've entitled it, I've named it Planner's Kryptonite. Planner's Kryptonite. The Inscrutable Variable and the Impenetrable Veil. In other words, I wanted to address two things that absolutely wreck your planning efforts. Two things that wreck your planning efforts. We might call them planner's kryptonite. The impenetrable veil and the inscrutable variable, that variable that you cannot understand, that you cannot determine in advance. We fool ourselves that we can contain, control, and direct these two things, but they defeat us regardless of our superhero planning qualities if we don't acknowledge them and respect them for what they are. So these two things, now there are other things that can wreck your planning efforts, but these two things are chief, they're key. The first is the inscrutable variable, and that is human volition or free will. And I'll explain why this is quite the reef when you're trying to bring in that ship of planning into the harbor. The second one is the impenetrable veil, and that's the future, attempting to see into the future. If you are on X, and we're also live on Zoom, but if you go to the nest in X up above, and you can see that I've put a diagram up there that will follow a mental model to explain these things, to explain our inability to understand free will and human volition, and our inability to really pierce through that veil and to see into the future. As we set the table for this discussion, for this talk, you might ask yourself, you might survey some of the examples of profound, we might call them mission failures in recent years, and ask us what's at the crux, what's at the core of these mission failures, whether it's the war between Ukraine and Russia and how that's been panning out now, anything but a short conflict. And we have, quite often, we have amnesia. I captured very distinctly things that were said, prognostications, what strategists were saying about this conflict. And here we are, and it keeps dragging on and on and on. The war between Israel and Hamas, and now possibly Hezbollah, and how that's dragging on as well. And ultimately, Iran, and developments even today about how that may now be evolving and like an algae bloom, just expanding the scope of that conflict to include the emergence of the Houthis and their impacts on international shipping that was not foreseen. No one wrote about that. No one articulated that this could be a threat until, like a black swan, it popped, and then has been somewhat impactful. But let's look at some of the classical examples. Vietnam, Iraq and Afghanistan, OIF and OEF, in the grand strategic failures in both of those cases. Why is that when we've had some of the most brilliant minds, greatest minds, planners, commanders, at all levels working so hard in both of those theaters, only for there to be a rout, a departure from Kabul that was nationally embarrassing. MCTP, or Mission Command Training Program, simulated war games in almost every battle, almost every campaign that I participated in as the Op 4 commander of MCTP. NTC, the National Training Center, almost, and maybe there are some exceptions out there, but almost without exception, mission failures and very poor showings. And again, I'm pulling out examples, real world examples of activities, of missions, of examples of when folks engaged in a great deal of planning and design, campaign planning, worked hard to try to bring about a future desired end state of some type, and yet failed to do so, and failed to ascertain or discern incredible black swan events or exceptional information that popped that the planning efforts couldn't foresee in advance and plan for and account for. You might even go into the political realm and think about Donald Trump's attempt to run for president again, and the twists and turns that that has taken that folks did not see, that commentators, that talking heads did not anticipate. And we also have now what I would say is a widespread backlash against, air quotes, experts. A widespread backlash against experts, from media to scientists. And that would include climate scientists, vaccine scientists, to politicians, to economics, to military experts. There's an increasing and accelerating repudiation of experts because we see ongoing examples of an inability to account for free will and human volition and to pierce beyond the veil to anticipate events and be able to plan for them and establish plans that weather first contact with the enemy, that weather exposure to emergent reality when it pops. And what I've noticed is rarely, if ever, does anyone go back and do a post-mortem and really do a hard-hitting analysis of plans, of planning efforts. To go back and give the planners, the operational designers, the commanders, the CEOs, folks who really engaged in detailed planning and say, hey, look, how did you do? How did you do? You didn't do well. And why is that? How close did you come? Did you in any way achieve anything close to a future desired state? It seems like we often have collective amnesia and we just continue rushing headlong into the next challenge. Now, why is this important? If you pull down and look at, and I'll bring it up on Zoom, I'll share the screen there. For the diagram, the mental model, you'll see a brain there occupying the dominant space in the mental model. This represents the collaborative planning of all of the individuals involved in any given planning construct. from their grand strategic to a CEO and his company, engaged in innovation to bring a product line to the forefront or a new process, a way of doing something, military planning, on and on it goes. And you see surrounding that brain, you see a whole litany. It's not inclusive. There are many other examples, many other protocols. We see many prominent types of ways of thinking, ways of planning, ways of framing the problem such that you can then treat the problem. Some you may be familiar with, others you may not. Semiotic squares, systemic design, MDMP, the military decision-making process, SOD, systemic operational design, initially crafted by an Israeli general, Shimon Nave, red teaming, the Z method, OODA loop, SWOT analysis, JPP, the joint planning process, the NATO OPP, COG analysis, the Carver matrix, rhizomatic thinking. There are so many different ways, so many different constructs for approaching planning, for approaching establishing a design to move forward, to move from where we are now, whether it's business, finance, military, politics, where we are now that we aren't satisfied with, to get to some place that we want to be, that we will be happy with, that we will be satisfied with, moving to a future state of some type. And what I would suggest is, if you look at the brain stem on that model, look down below and you see two different words there. Newtonian moving into quantum. An observation I have is that as a result of the litany of planning failures, the litany of design failures in the real world, those who think about this deeply have challenged themselves to figure out, why have we not done better? Why have we not done better? And there is a large movement afoot. Some folks believe that it's because we have been trapped in a Newtonian world, in an outdated Newtonian construct of reality, and that now we need to move to a quantum world. From the Newtonian mechanistic, objective, deterministic framework to a quantum framework. And so in this regard, I just want to read a couple paragraphs from a book called The Soul of Science by Piercy and Thaxton. And they sum it up, and it gives us something to think about. And they say, the revolution in physics in the 20th century created a revolution in worldview, undermining the Newtonian paradigm that had reigned for nearly 3 centuries. Gone was the image of the universe as a cold, impersonal machine. Gone the image of humans as mere cogs in the mechanism. It was a revolution welcomed by everyone who had chafed under the deterministic model inherited from Newtonian physics. They hailed the new physics as a great emancipator. It seemed to open the door once again to free will and human dignity. But the revolution also had a disturbing side. Gone as well was the certainty of an objective order in the world. Gone was the confidence in the human ability to discover any coherent truth. British physicist John Gribbin leads off an otherwise sober book about the new physics with a sweeping assertion. What quantum mechanics says is that nothing is real. For example, quantum mechanics has revealed a realm of indeterminacy. But what exactly does that mean? Is indeterminacy a statement of human ignorance? We just don't know yet all the laws that govern quantum events? Or is it an irreducible characteristic of matter? Does indeterminacy provide a loophole for human freedom? Or does it reveal mere randomness? Even today, nearly a century after quantum mechanics first appeared, scientists disagree on the answers to these questions. The most curious feature of quantum mechanics is that it works exceedingly well as a practical and mathematical description of the atomic world. Yet it has given a rise to a plethora of unresolved disputes over its philosophical interpretation. Physicists harbor no doubt about the usefulness of the mathematical formulas of quantum mechanics, yet they engage in ongoing debates about its ontology, what it tells us about the nature of reality. Physicist J.C. Polkinghorne says the situation in quantum mechanics is rather like being shown an impressively beautiful palace and being told that no one is quite sure whether its foundations rest on bedrock or on shifting sand. And so that's from the soul of science. And we see this in the recent and emergent planning and design constructs that we can read about. And I would just like to plug a very excellent book here by Dr. Ben Zwiebelson. It's called Beyond the Pale, recently published. Beyond the Pale. And he treats the reader to a vast survey of new and emergent planning protocols, design protocols, protocols for thinking about thinking, issues associated with all this. And it's an incredible book. I'd highly recommend it. You can get it from the Air University Press. Again, Ben Zwiebelson, Dr. Zwiebelson. A great expose there. But if you look at the planning model again, what you'll see to the top is the inscrutable variable, and that's free will. The free will of human beings, when you're planning something, whether it's actions you're taking in another area, with another culture, with a litany of millions of different individuals with volition, the more that free will is involved, the more difficult the planning effort becomes. Because we don't know what's behind the veil of human volition. We really don't know what's going to resonate, what's not going to resonate, how well something will resonate or not. The level of difficulty, the level of inscrutability increases when you then try to ascertain folks with free will from another culture. Then the level of difficulty catapults. And we often mirror image the way we think upon other people. But that's flawed, incredibly flawed. there are so many instances where we take our own ideas and prejudices and preferences and cultural thought patterns and superimpose those upon others, certainly in the military realm. But then look at the model. You see the vertical yellow bar, which I call the event horizon or the causation horizon, that separates the present from the future. That we can only see past that causation horizon, that event horizon, just millimeters into it, based on history that we've read about in the past. Is it good history? Is it not well documented, written by flawed individuals with selective memories, with finite ability to capture data and really understand the context of the past, especially the deeper into the past you go? But we can only pierce through that veil millimeters. And the deeper we try to move into the future, the more off base we're going to be, the more off base. And when you look to the right of that causation horizon, you see a box of two dashed boxes and a circle that's dashed. This is the intended future state for any planning effort. The larger construct is the digital cyber Pangea, or the unified world that's unified digitally by the cyberverse, the digital terrain of the world that's interconnected. Or as you bring that in closer from the digital Pangea, then you have actual terrain, nations, topography, boundaries, both natural and man-made. What are you seeking to change in the natural topography, in the nation state, the Westphalian construct that's surrounded by the digital cyberverse? And then within that digital cyberverse and then the physical terrain, we then have people of all types. Power brokers, political, financial, military, social media, influencers. Depending on what you're trying to do, whether it's a CEO in a global corporation trying to launch a product line, how will it be perceived in the future in the cyberverse, in the social media ecosystem? How will it be perceived in different nation states or different markets defined by national boundaries or cultural boundaries of people living within topographical boundaries? That dashed shape there on the right side of the causation horizon into the future, this is what we're aiming at. But that's what we're aiming at, or an entity is aiming at, a commander's aiming at, a CEO, they're aiming at that currently, right now, what we think we want. And if it takes a long time to get there, in the case of like military, OIF, OEF come to mind, in Afghanistan and Iraq, where we think we want to go today, or at the beginning of a conflict, usually morphs quite a bit, contingent on our ability or inability to achieve initial goals that are laid out. And so there's a chronological aspect to planning that makes the planning irrelevant or inappropriate or unsuited for realities once they emerge. Again, the two elements of kryptonite that doom planning efforts: free will of people, because we really can't see through that and anticipate how people will react to different products we're innovating, to different processes, or to different political movements, political campaigns, military campaigns. You'll see the balls bouncing off of the causation horizon in the model. These are plans and orders, ideas that we have, and we plan in the now, in the present, but they bounce off that horizon and they can't pierce through because they're inappropriate and they don't work. And so I'm going to pause for a minute to see if we have any questions before moving on.
Yeah, Bill, just a question from me, kind of going towards your speaking points here. So what do you think the biggest pitfalls you notice both inside and outside the conflict in the Middle East from the United States perspective, and not meeting the desired end states of the United States? Was it over planning, commander turnover, or like the eyes on the prize, new shiny object as we continued on in the conflict? What do you think it was?
So this is a very loaded question and a very difficult question. Essentially, if I'm hearing you right, you're asking, at the end of the day, why did we fail in Iraq and Afghanistan? Why did all of those cumulative ongoing planning efforts by so many smart people, by so many devoted, committed, hardworking planners and strategists, and then folks who try to execute that, why did it eventually not achieve, certainly not achieve initial objectives? Then I would argue didn't achieve interim objectives in year 2, year 3, year 10, year 15. And then we could argue didn't achieve any objectives at the end of the day, as we see the situation today in both those countries. And so how do we account for that? What's the cause of that? And there are a number of things that led to the failure of those comprehensive chronological planning efforts. But the two kryptonite variables here that we're talking about tonight are at the root of it. Number one, the free will and volition of people. In other words, did we understand the Afghan people on a very close and personal, objective basis? Do we really know where their sentiments lied? What made them tick? What they would, in a long-term way, in a sustainable way, resonate? And the same with the Iraqis. Well, I don't give fault to any planners for not being able to do that. I don't cast aspersions on them or lay fault at their feet because, and this is why I've labeled this the inscrutable variable. You can't do it, is the answer. I can't get a bead for, get a understanding of the sentiment of the people in the county in which I live. There are just too many people, let alone the state in which I live here in the United States. And I'm from this culture. I speak this language. How am I possibly going to be able to, if I can't do it in my own backyard, how am I going to be able to grasp in any meaningful, objective way the collective and meaningful subunit of volitions and motivations of a foreign culture, let alone a foreign culture in Iraq of multiple religions, Sunni, Shia, Sufi, different geographic Iraqis with different dialects. It's impossible to do. This is why I call it the inscrutable variable. So if you're planning effort, look back to that model and all of those things surrounding and floating around the brain, many processes and ways of planning. If your method, if your process doesn't acknowledge the inscrutability of understanding collective and group free will, then you're already dooming the results of your planning effort to being inappropriate. Number two, what is the other aspect? Well, what is the other major contributor to failure? And I would say that this is the second piece of kryptonite here. It's that causation horizon. It's an inability to see into the future. We don't know, and you'll see to the right of that line of the horizon, you'll see black swans. There will always be black swans, these surprise events that pop, that we cannot, by definition, we cannot plan for them in advance. We can't have any inkling that it's going to occur in advance. Beyond that, a black swan event will pop at some point, but what will it be? Who knows? But by definition, it will be a surprise event, meaning you won't divine it, and it will have a major effect on what you're trying to achieve. What's the so what of that? Because you logically can't be expected to be able to divine something that is undivinable, that you can't anticipate in advance by definition. What this means is your process now needs to not only account for the free will of human beings, and then your question is going to be, well, how do you do that? And this is the major question, isn't it? First, you have to be aware of it, absolutely aware that this is a thing, and ensure your plan now. You're figuring out with your planning team, how do we account for the fact that we really don't know the heart of the many different groups of people that we are impacting or trying to impact towards a certain end. But then number two, how does our plan accommodate black swans? In other words, is our plan so highly detailed, so highly contingent on decision points and a whole chain of events that are contingent on other events, and so interrelated like this, and crafted to such excruciating detail that there's no ability to flex and adapt and morph to the emergent reality once it becomes apparent. Mike, does that somehow start scratching the itch?
No, absolutely. I'm glad you brought it back to the model. I forgot to add that part in there. So appreciate you getting that. And then do you see any downfalls specifically with a more flexible model versus more detailed planning? I know detailed planning limits flexibility in planning, but do you see a negative on almost a too flexible of a plan to adjust to multiple things? Do you see any negatives there?
The phrase I like to use in the guidance I like to throw out there is your plan should have just enough detail. And you say, well, how do I measure that? How do I do that? What's just enough? And of course, that's going to be subjective. And this is where wisdom and skill, risk comes into place. But only plan in enough detail, in just enough detail that you need, and no more. And that has to be the barometer. That has to be the criteria that you use. Only enough detail to keep the plan moving forward. And then a major emphasis on reconnaissance. Reconnaissance needs to be very intentional, comprehensive, and ongoing, and multidisciplinary reconnaissance. Whether it's developing a product line in corporate America, what is your reconnaissance plan for assessing the consumer mood, the trends, the predispositions, the sentiment towards different types of products? And that's certainly in the military realm, this becomes very clear. The reconnaissance plan. Reconnaissance is so critically important, and so often it's not giving anywhere near the attention that it needs. Think of walking into a room full of furniture with no lights. This is walking into the future. You can't see where you're going. You can't see what black swan sofas are out there that you might stumble over. So what do? You're gonna go out there so much slowly. You're not gonna rush headlong with a plan of how you think that room is laid out, and you're gonna run in accordance with that layout of the plan that you think you have of the room, and you're gonna run at high speed. No, you're gonna realize, I don't know how this room is laid out. And there are objects in here that will take me out at the knees, and maybe staircases that will cause me to plunge and break my legs. I'm going to proceed cautiously with my fingers out there, my whiskers out there, like a cat, trying to sense the reality of that room that's veiled to me. And that's not clear until I'm there. That's the future. It's unclear until you're there, and it's the present. Until your fingers touch that sofa, it's the future, and you don't know. And a black swan event might be a big trap door in front of you that you fall 15 stories and break your pelvis. And so your plan has to be sufficient detail to move forward, but then you will fill in greater details as the future becomes more apparent and the lights in that room start turning on, and you see and you feel where you're at. Then you can start dialing it in and dialing it in and dialing it in while you're confirming or denying assumptions that you made prior to entering into the future, into that dark room. And so part of that reconnaissance plan then has to be focused on realizing and looking for, very keenly looking for black swans, and knowing that they're going to occur, but looking at all of the different facets of the future in the different realms, the political, the social media realm, the military realm, economic realm, whatever it is, because again, all of this applies to many different endeavors of life. But that reconnaissance needs to be multidisciplinary, multi-realm, always looking for the black swans. And then when a swan emerges, quickly assessing it to see, now look at the model, at those triangles, ECI, emergent critical information. A black swan might occur, a surprise event that's very impactful, that has a major effect, but it can't really be exploited or really be leveraged in accordance with what we want to accomplish. But sometimes the black swan will be exploitable and have the ability to be leveraged in a very advantageous way. And this is when I call it an emergent piece of critical information. Emergent critical information, ECI. If you're not intentionally looking for these things, then you're going to often craft a very detailed plan, and then by God, you're going to push that plan through no matter what. So you have this little quip that no plan survives first contact with the enemy. That's absolutely wrong. Tragically, that's absolutely wrong. The reality of the situation that I've experienced over 30 years is almost all plans survive first contact with the future, with the enemy when it emerges. And even though that enemy emerges and the plan isn't appropriate to that threat, yet because we spent so much time developing the plan, like a zombie, must survive. And this is why so many planning efforts fail. You want to plan just enough and then be looking for the black swans. I'll pause there for a minute if you have any further comments or questions on that. So what are the takeaways from this? This is the box in the upper left-hand side of the model. What are the takeaways? Number one, it's not so much about the process you use. Again, we have many theorists scrambling and trying to figure out different processes and trying to figure out what's wrong with the processes we've been using in the past, as if that's a problem and as if that was the issue why we didn't achieve victory, that we have old Newtonian processes and we have to figure out new avant-garde ways of addressing problem resolution, problem solving, problem neutralization, whatever you want to call it. I would argue it's not so much the process or the tool. You know what? Perhaps MDMP could work fine. Military decision-making process. Perhaps SWOT analysis. Perhaps that's good enough. Perhaps that tool is good enough. Perhaps ADM, Army Design Methodology, is good enough. Maybe this is not where the problem is at in trying to develop a better process. Number two, it's more about the mindset. This is my suggestion. It's just like Kung Fu. Which form, which style should I use to defeat the enemy? Should I use Tiger style? Maybe White Lotus style? Maybe Iron Buddha style or Monkey style? You know what? At the end of the day, maybe it's not so much the style. Don't worry so much about the style. The vast majority of styles are probably pretty good. It could be the mindset of the practitioner that's the problem. And specifically, are you acknowledging the free will of human beings? And are you also acknowledging that you are not omniscient? That you don't have the ability to see through the veil into the future, to really understand causality. See, one of the problems of faulty planning is intellectual arrogance. Intellectual arrogance. A mindset of humility using almost any of these tools or processes could work just fine and might be able to do just fine. Intellectual arrogance is the killer. Number three, in humility, acknowledge what you don't and what you can't know. Acknowledge what you don't know and what you can't know. Number four, spend time developing and resourcing a redundant reconnaissance plan for the first thing. the things that you don't know, confirming or denying assumptions. Number 5, bake into your plan intentional flexibility, intentional adaptability. For the second thing, the things that you can't know. You can't know what's in the future. Pre-emergent black swans. You're not going to know this. And so, as with quality leadership, the problems of planning come down to arrogance. In this case, quite often, in the planning realm, intellectual arrogance. Thinking that we know much more than we do, thinking we have a handle on causality when we don't. And so I will pause there for any other thoughts or comments.
Bill, do you have a moment in your career where you yourself were intellectually arrogant in your planning process and it came back to haunt you, or you saw a leader that you worked for fall for that mistake?
I think if we're honest with ourselves, there's always periods of intellectual arrogance that crop up. Certainly when you start learning things and you start gaining credentials, and I know I went to the School of Advanced Military Studies, SAMS, and you start getting exposed to so many different disciplines, different ideas, different theorists. It was a target-rich environment for a curious mind. And the danger there is getting arrogant, saying, wow, I'm being trained to be a planner, a very skilled problem solver, a solver and slayer of wicked problems. And you're faced then with your subsequent assignments. Suddenly you have audience with general officers who are listening to you and listening to your ideas. And so you're regularly, you come to the fork in the road where you can start getting arrogant, thinking that you're such a 50-pound head and folks want to hear what you have to say and your ideas. And if you start running with that 50-pound head, you lean that 50-pound head forward, and just the weight of that head starts throwing you down the path. Well, you're going to bash your head on the rocks, and you're going to knock yourself out and have a concussion. You're going to have TBI or whatnot because of your arrogance, because you're going to find that your plans aren't that good at the end of the day. And then what you'll do at that point is you'll say, well, it's the operators. They just didn't execute the incredible plan that I came up with. That's always the out of the planner. That's always the rationale in the out of the planner. Is that the operator didn't execute them properly because the plan was good. There's another fork in the road. There's another path you can take, and you can say, you know what? My head's not that big. It's a pea brain. I've been blessed to learn a lot about planning, but this teaches me that I don't know a lot, that there's so much that we can't grasp. And yet we're charged with coming up with a plan. We have to take action. We're charged with a mission, or we're in charge of an innovation team. Once I was in charge of an expansion plan for a university, for an expansion campus in another state. And there are many issues associated with that adventure. And at this point, I realized the challenges associated with it, and I could not see how we're going to get from the current state to the intended state by the boss. Well, what happens when you're in a military construct and you see what you're told to do, what our intended future state is meant to achieve, but then as you look at the culture, you look at the competing agendas, the competing motivations of the myriad people and myriad different types of micro groups, and then larger groups, the linguistic, dialectic groups, religious groups. And you start thinking that, you know what, that which we're told to accomplish might not be within the realm of the feasible. Now, what do? If you surface that, there'll always be other planners that have 50-pound heads and say, oh, no, that's wrong. We absolutely can do it. And here's why. You just haven't studied it enough. And here's what we need to do X, Y, and Z. And so this is where, in larger planning groups, ego and personalities come into play as well, which bring about groupthink, cliques, favoritism with commanders and bosses and CEOs. And so this is all part of that inscrutable variable of free will, because it's not just the target audience or the target groups, it's also the free will of the planners involved and the decision makers involved. And that further complicates the planning maelstrom. That's a long-winded answer to your question.
I thought it was great. The only really caveat I have to that is it seems like a lot of to overcome, you need humility. Obviously, is probably your biggest factor. So how do you ensure that you have humility in influencing the other planners around you to demonstrate humility in their planning? Like just beyond yourself, because when you're generally planning, whether it's corporate America or military, you're generally working on a team and you're trying to convey your plans, but how do you influence others to also show that same humility?
Well, and this is the challenge of life. This is the challenge. What you're speaking to is, how do you persuade, inspire, motivate others, persuade others that the path of humility is the path of objective strength, the path of authenticity, the path of not having deep soul regrets later in life. And this is where developing this interpersonal kung fu is very important, but it can't be answered in a soundbite. But the very first thing that you have to do is you yourself have to be persuaded that arrogance is the killer, that a life of arrogance will only hurt you in the end and hurt others. Once you're persuaded, then the second thing that you have to do, which is very powerful, is you have to model it. In your interrelationships with other people, you have to model it with other people. If you model it authentically, genuinely with other people, they will sense that. They will see that you're not putting on a show, that you really do believe that you're nothing special, and that you do study hard and you try to understand things, and you're not putting on airs of trying to arrogate to yourself divinity, watered down divinity, watered down omniscience of a type. They'll realize that you're thinking soberly about yourself, objectively about yourself, and that will impact other people. It doesn't guarantee that it's going to impact everyone or even impact the high-powered decision makers that you might be working for. And all of that is just part of the Thunderdome and going into the ring. Because there are no secrets to that. There are no, I can't give you 4 points on how to be immediately successful every time with that. Every time you go into Thunderdome, it's a different fight. And so that's my short answer to that very powerful question you asked, Mike.
Awesome. Thanks, Bill.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I appreciate the time that those of you joining us and who may be listening to this afterwards. Just a few insights from a planner, having done this for over 30 years in multiple contexts, from the military and peace and war to academia, to then high-tech, ultra high-tech, robotic corporate America. And so what I'm offering you is a little glimpse from a practitioner's perspective, not from just an academic theorist who writes books. Those folks are very valuable to the profession, but at some point you have to get out and actively get mud under your nails and blood under your nails and work down in the trenches and see what works and what doesn't work. And so these are my few thoughts on that. In the planning realm, planning kryptonite, the two things that are going to doom your planning efforts. And that is the free will of human beings and thinking that you have a beat on that, and then thinking that you can see into the future, either based on the past or based on ideas that you have now that you think are so compelling that you will bend space and time in the future to your will. Well, you're not going to do it because those black swans have massive fangs and huge claws, and they will shred you. They will rake your flesh, the black swans. So you have to have humble fear, respect of the black swans, because they will emerge, and then try to harness the black swans. So that was just a few thoughts there. Again, it's not so much that our planning processes are outdated and Newtonian. It's that we've embarked on quests that maybe we shouldn't have because we didn't understand the realities as they were, and or that we've grown increasingly arrogant, and or that we've had this headlong rush into the quantum, metaphysically agnostic, even nihilistic world. And that's trapped us in the trap of our own construction. And so it's not so much the tools, it's what's in our hearts that's the problem. And so, again, thanks for listening. If you are in any way interested in having someone assist you in your innovation efforts or your planning efforts or your team building efforts, maybe you want help establishing a leadership development program in your group, or maybe you're just interested in one-on-one personal coaching. If this is the case, drop me a line at Locked In Leadership, Bill at Locked In Leadership. Send me a message, send me an email, and let's have a quick chat to see if maybe my 30 years of experience might be of some use to you, might be helpful to you and to your team. Love to have a talk with you. In the meantime, I wish you the best of health, the greatest of success in your career and in your life. And so this is Colonel Bill signing out.